I was already in bed when my phone rang. 1:42 a.m. That kind of call never brings good news. My hands were shaking before I even picked up. "This is Officer Taylor. Is this Diana Miller?" "Yes," I said, my voice tight. "There's been an accident. Your husband, Martin, was involved in a crash on Highway 12. He's in critical condition at St. Vincent's Hospital." My breath caught. "Critical. You should come as soon as possible, ma'am." I don't remember hanging up. I don't remember getting dressed. I only remember running into Dallas's room. My daughter was half asleep when I shook her awake. "Mom," she mumbled. "It's your father," I said, my voice cracking. "We have to go now." The drive to the hospital was a blur. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. Dallas sat beside me, silent but wide-eyed. She was scared. So was I. When we got there, the nurse at the front desk barely looked up. "Miller, car crash?" I asked, my voice coming out more desperate than I intended. She nodded toward the ICU. "Dr. Patel will be with you shortly." I grabbed Dallas's hand and walked in, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then I saw him. Martin was almost unrecognizable, bandaged, bruised, and hooked up to too many machines. My stomach turned. The beeping of the monitors, the sterile smell of the hospital, it made it all too real. Dr. Patel walked in with a clipboard. His expression was serious. "Mrs. Miller, your husband sustained severe head trauma. We've stabilized him, but he's in a coma. It's too early to tell the extent of the damage." Dallas let out a small sob, and I pulled her close. "How did it happen?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The doctor hesitated, glancing at the officer standing behind him. "We're still investigating," Officer Taylor said. "But from the scene, it looks like it may have been intentional." Everything inside me froze. "What?" I said, stepping back. There were no skid marks, no sign of braking. The car went straight into the guardrail at high speed. The officer explained. "Do you know if your husband was struggling with anything lately? Stress? Depression?" I forced myself to breathe. "No," I lied. Because I knew. I knew exactly why Martin might have driven off the road. And so did Dallas. But we weren't going to tell them. Not yet. Dallas wouldn't stop crying. She sat in one of those stiff hospital chairs, knees pulled to her chest, her face hidden behind her arms. I wanted to comfort her, but I could barely breathe myself. Intentional. The word clung to me like a weight, pressing down on my chest. I forced myself to focus. "Are you sure?" I asked the officer. "There's no way this was just an accident." Officer Taylor sighed. "We're not ruling anything out. But no skid marks, no signs of mechanical failure. It's suspicious." Suspicious. Another heavy word. I nodded, keeping my face blank. I had to. "Let me know if you remember anything unusual," the officer said, handing me his card. "Sometimes little things make sense later." I took it with a shaky hand, nodding again. He left, and I turned back to Dallas. "We need to be careful," she whispered, voice thick with tears. "I know. What if they find out?" "They won't." She stared at me, eyes wide and terrified. "But what if he wakes up?" I swallowed hard. That was the real question, wasn't it? If Martin woke up, everything would fall apart. The truth would come out. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Martin's wrecked car, his broken body, the beeping machines keeping him alive. And the officer's words. It may have been intentional. Dallas was curled up on the hospital couch, her breathing uneven. She hadn't said much after our whispered conversation, but I knew she was thinking the same thing I was. If Martin woke up, what would he say? By morning, the questions started. Nurses, doctors, even friends and family who had heard the news. What happened? How was he acting before the crash? Did he seem different? I repeated the same answers over and over. He was just tired. He's been stressed with work. No, there were no problems between us. Lie, lie, lie. Every word fell heavier, but I had no choice. The truth would destroy everything. By the afternoon, Martin's parents arrived. His mother, Linda, grabbed my hands the second she saw me. "Diana, what happened?" Her voice was raw with grief. "I don't know," I whispered. "The police are still investigating." Another lie. She squeezed my hands so tight it hurt. "Martin would never do something like this." "Never." I nodded, pretending to agree. But I knew better, because I knew exactly what had pushed him to that moment. And I wasn't about to let anyone else find out. The waiting room smelled like stale coffee and antiseptic. I sat with Martin's mother, Linda, while Dallas picked at a vending machine snack she had no intention of eating. The silence between us was thick, heavy with unspoken questions. Martin's father, Greg, paced near the door. Every few minutes he would stop, rub his face, then start pacing again. "They're wrong," he muttered under his breath. "My son didn't do this." Linda nodded fiercely. "Martin wouldn't just drive into a guardrail. He's not that kind of man." Then her sharp eyes landed on me. "Diana, did you notice anything? Anything at all?" I swallowed, keeping my expression neutral. "He's been tired. Work stress. That's all." She stared at me, like she didn't quite believe it. Before she could press further, a nurse walked in. "Mrs. Miller." I jumped up. "Yes, your husband's condition is stable for now, but there's still no sign of consciousness. The doctor would like to speak with you privately." Privately. That word made my stomach twist. Linda straightened. "I'll come with you." "No," I said quickly, then softened my voice. "I'll ask everything and update you, I promise." She hesitated, but sat back down. Greg kept pacing. I followed the nurse down the hallway, heart pounding. When we reached the doctor's office, I stepped inside and found Officer Taylor waiting. My breath caught. "Is something wrong?" Dr. Patel folded his hands on the desk. "Mrs. Miller, we've reviewed your husband's medical records. There's something you should know." I forced myself to stay calm. "What?" The doctor hesitated. "We found traces of alcohol in his system." My mouth went dry. "Alcohol?" "Yes. Not a large amount, but enough to impair judgment." My mind raced. Martin wasn't a heavy drinker. He never came home drunk. But that night, something had snapped. Officer Taylor leaned forward. "Mrs. Miller, we need to know. Was Martin drinking at home before the accident?" I hesitated just a second too long. His sharp gaze caught it. "Mrs. Miller." I forced myself to shake my head. Not that I saw. Another lie. But from the way Officer Taylor looked at me, I knew he wasn't convinced. And that scared me more than anything. I walked out of that office with my heart pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. Alcohol in his system? That was a complication I hadn't expected. As soon as I stepped back into the waiting area, Linda was on her feet. "What do they say?" I forced a tight smile. "He's stable. Still unconscious, but stable." She searched my face. And nothing. "We just have to wait." Greg finally stopped pacing and turned to me. "Did they say anything about the crash?" I shook my head. "Not yet." Lie. Again. I could feel Dallas watching me from her chair. Eyes narrowed. She was smart. She knew me too well. Linda sighed and sat down, gripping her rosary like it could bring Martin back to her. Greg, on the other hand, didn't move. He just kept staring at me, like he was trying to figure something out. I turned away and sat next to Dallas. She leaned in, voice low. "They don't believe you." My stomach twisted. "What are you talking about?" She shot a quick glance at her grandparents, then back at me. "Officer Taylor. He knows you lied." I swallowed hard. "Dallas, keep your voice down." She crossed her arms, looking pale and shaken. "What if they find out everything? What if they start digging?" I exhaled slowly, trying to stay calm. "Then we make sure they don't." She didn't say anything else, but the look on her face made it clear. She was scared. And for good reason. Because if the police kept pushing, if they really started looking into our lives, they'd find the truth. And everything would come crashing down. I thought we had more time. I thought if I kept playing my part, worried wife, grieving mother, devoted daughter-in-law, things would settle down. But the universe had other plans. It was late evening when my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number. Hello? Mrs. Miller. The voice was firm, professional. Yes. This is Detective Harris with the St. Vincent PD. I'd like to ask you a few more questions about your husband's accident. My stomach dropped. I already spoke to Officer Taylor. Yes, I know. But there are a few inconsistencies in the report we need to clarify. Would you be available to come down to the station tomorrow mornings? Inconsistencies. I tightened my grip on the phone. Can we do this over the phone? I'd prefer to speak in person. Of course he would. I forced my voice to stay steady. All right. I'll be there. When I hung up, Dallas was standing in the doorway, her face pale. Who was that? The police. Her breath hitched. Mom. I held up a hand. We're fine. It's just routine. She shook her head. No, it's not. They're digging. I walked over and grabbed her shoulders. Listen to me. We stick to the story, no matter what. Tears welled in her eyes. And if they don't believe us, I forced a smile, though my heart was pounding. Then we make them. But deep down, I knew. This was the beginning of the end. The next morning, I sat in the police station, my hands folded tightly in my lap. The room was cold, the fluorescent lights too bright. Across from me, Detective Harris studied a file, Martin's file. I forced myself to stay calm. I had practiced my answers in my head all night. Stick to the story. Act natural. The detective finally looked up. Mrs. Miller, thank you for coming in. I nodded. Of course. I want to help however I can. He flipped through a few pages. We've been reviewing the details of the crash. Your husband had alcohol in his system. Did you know he'd been drinking that night? I shook my head, keeping my expression neutral. No, I didn't see him drink at all. He studied me, tapping his pen against the table. You told Officer Taylor that Martin had been stressed. What exactly was going on? I let out a careful sigh, like a wife trying to explain away normal struggles. Work had been rough. He was exhausted. He just hadn't been himself lately. Harris nodded slowly. And your marriage? Any issues? I swallowed. No major issues. His gaze sharpened. But there were some issues. I froze for half a second before forcing a soft chuckle. Every marriage has small things, detective, but nothing serious. He leaned back. See, here's the problem, Mrs. Miller. We have a witness. My heart stopped. A witness? Harris nodded. Someone who saw Martin about an hour before the crash. And they said he looked upset, angry, even. I felt my palms start to sweat. Who? I can't disclose that just yet, he said. But they mentioned that he was arguing with someone on the phone. My stomach twisted into a knot. Harris tilted his head. Would you happen to know who that might have been? I opened my mouth, ready to lie, ready to say no. But then my phone buzzed in my pocket. I ignored it, until Harris nodded toward it. Go ahead. Answer it. I pulled out my phone, and my blood ran cold when I saw the name on the screen. Martin. I nearly dropped the phone. Harris noticed. What's wrong? He asked, watching me closely. I swallowed hard and forced a tight smile. Nothing. Then I let the call go to voicemail, because I knew the truth. Martin wasn't calling me. Someone else had his phone. And whoever it was wanted me to know it. I walked out of the police station in a daze, my hands trembling as I gripped my phone. I couldn't breathe. My mind kept repeating the same thought over and over. Martin wasn't calling me. Who had his phone? As soon as I got into my car, I checked my voicemail. My heart pounded as I pressed play. At first, there was silence. Then a low, ragged breath. And a voice I didn't recognize. You think you can lie your way out of this, Diana? My whole body went cold. I slammed the phone onto the passenger seat like it had burned me. This wasn't possible. This wasn't happening. My hands shook as I grabbed the wheel. I needed to get home. I needed to think. The drive back felt like a blur, my mind racing through possibilities. Was this some kind of sick joke? Did Martin tell someone something before the crash? When I pulled into the driveway, Dallas was already waiting at the door, arms crossed. She must have seen my face, because her expression turned to panic. What happened? She demanded. I didn't answer. I walked past her, straight into the kitchen, and downed a glass of water with shaky hands. Mom, Dallas snapped. Talk to me. I turned to her, voice barely above a whisper. Someone called me from your father's phone. Her face drained of color. What? I pulled up the voicemail and played it on speaker. As soon as the voice came through, Dallas stepped back like she had been hit. She looked at me, wide-eyed. Who is that? I shook my head. I don't know. We stood in silence for a moment, the weight of it pressing down on both of us. Then, Dallas whispered the thought that had been haunting me since I left the police station. What if Dad woke up? I stared at her, my breath catching in my throat. Because if Martin was awake, then we were in serious trouble. Dallas and I stared at each other, the silence between us deafening. My phone was still clutched in my hand, the voicemail playing on repeat in my mind. You think you can lie your way out of this, Diana? I didn't realize I was shaking until Dallas grabbed my wrist. Mom, we need to go to the hospital. I snapped out of it. What? If Dad woke up, we have to know what he remembers, she said, her voice trembling. What if he tells them everything? I hesitated. My instincts screamed at me to wait, to think. But she was right. If Martin was awake, we had to act fast. Get your coat, I said, already grabbing my keys. The drive to the hospital felt endless. My hands gripped the steering wheel, so hard my knuckles turned white. Dallas sat stiff beside me, eyes fixed straight ahead. Neither of us spoke. When we got to the ICU, I forced myself to stay calm, act normal, act like a worried wife. At the nurse's station, I plastered on a shaky smile. Hi, I'm Diana Miller. I was just wondering, has my husband shown any signs of waking up? The nurse frowned, checking her chart. No, he's still unresponsive. I exhaled sharply, relief washing over me. Not awake. Not yet. Are you sure? Dallas blurted out. No movement at all. The nurse shook her head. No change. But if there's anything specific you're worried about, the doctor can. No, I cut in quickly. I thought I saw a missed call from his phone. I must have imagined it. The nurse gave me a sympathetic smile, the kind reserved for grieving wives. I understand. The stress can play tricks on you. I nodded, forcing a small laugh. Probably. We walked toward Martin's room, but I barely heard the nurse calling after us. Because something wasn't adding up. If Martin was still in a coma, who had his phone? Dallas must have had same thought, because when we reached the door to his room, she grabbed my arm. Mom, she whispered. What if someone else knows? I didn't have an answer, but as I reached for the handle, my phone vibrated in my pocket. Another message. This time, just 2 words. I know. My breath caught in my throat. Someone was playing games with me, and I had no idea how much they knew, or how far they were willing to go. I stood frozen outside Martin's hospital room, my phone still in my hand. I know. 2 words. 2 simple words that sent a chill down my spine. Dallas saw the message and grabbed my arm. Mom, what do we do? I didn't have an answer. I wanted to tell her everything was fine, that this was some kind of mistake. But we both knew better. Someone was toying with us. I forced myself to breathe and pushed open the door. Martin was exactly where we had left him. Still, unconscious, machines beeping steadily around him. His face was pale, his body covered in wires and tubes. Definitely not awake, but his phone was missing. I turned to Dallas, whispering so no one outside could hear. Check his things. She nodded, moving quickly to the small cabinet beside his bed. She rifled through the plastic hospital bag containing his clothes, wallet, wedding ring. No phone. I felt my stomach drop. It was here, before. Dallas looked up at me, eyes wide. So someone took it. My mind raced. Who had access to this room? Nurses, doctors, family. Linda and Greg had been here all day. Had they taken it? Had they seen something? I swallowed hard. If they had, I needed to know now. Just then, the door creaked open behind us. I turned, expecting a nurse. But it wasn't. It was Linda. Her sharp eyes locked onto mine, and she stepped inside, her face unreadable. "Diana," she said softly. "We need to talk." Dallas stiffened beside me. I forced a smile. "Of course. What's wrong?" Linda's eyes flicked to Martin's unconscious form, then back to me. She tilted her head, her voice calm, but cold. "I think you already know." I forced myself to stay calm, even though my heart was racing. "A whiskey bottle," I repeated, feigning confusion. Martin never drank whiskey. Officer Taylor studied me, tapping his pen against his notebook. "Yet we found one in his car." Dallas shifted beside me, her breathing uneven. I had to end this conversation before she gave something away. I let out a tired sigh. "I don't know what to tell you, officer. I wasn't with Martin before the crash. Maybe someone else was." Taylor didn't look convinced. "You sure about that?" I met his gaze. Positive. After a long pause, he nodded. "All right. Let me know if you remember anything else." He walked out, leaving the air thick with tension. Dallas turned to me the second the door shut. "Mom, someone's messing with us." I nodded, gripping my phone. "We need to find out who." I checked the message again. I know. No name. No number. Just a faceless threat hanging over us. Then, as if to hammer the fear in deeper, another message popped up. "You should have told the truth." A chill ran down my spine. I grabbed Dallas's hand and pulled her out of the room. "We're leaving. Now." We rushed through the hospital halls, my mind spinning. Someone knew. Someone wanted me to crack. As we stepped into the parking lot, my phone buzzed one last time. A photo. I clicked on it with shaking hands, and nearly dropped my phone. It was a picture of me and Dallas, standing in Martin's hospital room. Taken minutes ago. Someone was watching us, and they were closer than I ever imagined. I shoved my phone into my pocket, my breath coming too fast. My head whipped around the parking lot, scanning for anyone watching us. But the lot was mostly empty. Just a few nurses heading to their cars, and an old man smoking by the emergency exit. Dallas grabbed my arm. "Mom," she whispered, voice shaking. "What do we do?" I forced myself to stay calm. Panicking wouldn't help. "Get in the car." We climbed in, and I locked the doors. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. The phone buzzed again. Another message. "You can't hide the truth forever." A cold sweat broke out on my skin. Dallas stared at me. "Mom, do you think it's him?" I turned to her, confused. "Who?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Dad." I exhaled sharply. "Dallas, he's in a coma. He's not sending these." "But what if he was awake?" She shot back. "What if he told someone?" The thought made my stomach churn. If Martin had woken up, even for a moment, he could have said anything. To a nurse, a cop, a friend. Someone who had a reason to come after us. I needed to think. Fast. I scrolled through my messages again, looking for any clue. The number was blocked. No way to trace it. But the photo, that was a real threat. Someone had been in that hospital room with us. Watching. Listening. And they weren't done yet. I gripped the steering wheel, so tight my fingers ached. Dallas sat frozen beside me, her breathing fast and shallow. The weight of the last message pressed down on us. You can't hide the truth forever. Someone wanted us scared. It was working. I forced myself to think. Who could have been in that hospital room? The nurse. A visitor. A cop. It could be anyone. Dallas clutched her phone. "Mom, should we go to the police?" I hesitated. "And say what? That someone sent the creepy text? They'll think we're paranoid. But what if?" Before she could finish, my phone buzzed again. Another message. "Go home. Act normal. If you don't, I'll make sure everyone knows what you did." A chill ran down my spine. Dallas read over my shoulder. "Mom, they know." I swallowed hard. "We don't react. We do exactly what they said." I put the car in drive, pulling out of the hospital lot, my heart pounding the entire way home. Every car behind me felt like it was following. Every streetlight felt like a spotlight. When we got to the house, I hesitated before stepping out. What if they were watching us here too? Dallas was shaking. "Mom, this isn't going away." I nodded. "I know." We walked inside, locking every door behind us. The house felt eerily quiet, like someone had been inside and left just before we arrived. My phone buzzed one last time that night. One final message. "Good girl." My stomach twisted. Whoever this was, they weren't just watching. They were controlling us. The moment I read that last message, "Good girl," I felt sick. This wasn't just about the crash anymore. Whoever was doing this wasn't just threatening us. They were toying with us, watching us, controlling us. Dallas sat stiffly on the couch, her legs pulled to her chest, eyes locked on the front door like she expected someone to walk in at any second. I paced the living room, gripping my phone. This is getting worse. Dallas barely nodded. What do we do? I didn't have an answer. Going to the police wasn't an option. Not yet. Not when they were already suspicious of me. Instead, I did something risky. I grabbed a second phone, an old one I kept in the kitchen drawer. I used it to text a number I hadn't contacted in a long time. "I need to talk. Urgent." The response came almost immediately. "Unknown number. Took you long enough." My stomach twisted. Dallas sat up. "Who is that?" I hesitated before answering. Someone who might know what's going on. Because I had a suspicion. A dangerous one. If Martin was still in a coma, and if the police weren't the ones messing with me, then the only other person who might have a reason to threaten me was the person who knew the truth from the start. The person I thought I had covered for. The person I thought had just as much to lose. I met Dallas's wide, fearful eyes. "I think it's them," I whispered. "I think it's the person who was with your father the night of the crash." And if that was true, then I wasn't just being blackmailed. I was being hunted. The second my message was sent, I felt like I'd made a mistake. My hands shook as I held the old phone, my breath shallow. Dallas stared at me, waiting. "Who is it?" The phone buzzed. "Unknown number. Meet me." Same place as last time. Last time. My stomach churned. I knew who this was. I grabbed my coat. "Stay here." Dallas shot up from the couch. "No way. I'm coming with you." I hesitated. "Dallas." "I was there, Mom," she snapped. I deserved to know. She was right. We left, driving in silence. My mind replayed that night over and over. The argument, the shouting, the moment everything changed. I pulled into the old motel parking lot, hands gripping the wheel. The place was nearly abandoned, just a flickering neon light and a handful of cars. And then I saw them, standing under the street lamp, arms crossed, waiting. I stepped out, and Dallas followed. My heart pounded. They turned to face me, eyes cold. And that's when I knew this was never about Martin's crash. This was about what we did. And now, it was all about to come out. The street lamp buzzed overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow over the parking lot. The figure standing in front of me shifted slightly, hands stuffed into their jacket pockets. Dallas grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my sleeve. "Mom," she whispered, but I barely heard her. I was too focused on them. Madison, Martin's coworker, his friend, and the last person to see him before the crash. She let out a slow breath. "Took you long enough, Diana." I felt Dallas tense beside me. "You," she choked out. Madison's lips curled into a smirk. Me. My pulse pounded in my ears. "Why?" I demanded. "What do you want?" Her smirk faded. "What I wanted was for you to tell the truth." She took a step closer, her voice lowering. "But since you didn't, I had to handle things myself." Dallas looked between us, panicked. "Handle what?" Madison's eyes locked onto mine. "Your mother knows. She was there that night." Dallas whipped toward me. "Mom." I couldn't speak. My throat was dry, my hands ice cold. Madison let out a short laugh. "Guess she didn't tell you the full story." Dallas stepped back, her voice rising. "What story?" Madison tilted her head, eyes dark. "Tell her, Diana. Tell her what really happened that night." Dallas turned to me, eyes pleading. "Mom." I swallowed hard, every inch of me screaming to keep lying, to protect her. But I couldn't. Not anymore. Because Madison wasn't going to stop. And the truth? It was about to come out, whether I liked it or not. The second my message was sent, I knew I couldn't take it back. Dallas sat rigid beside me in the car, her fingers gripping the seat. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I swallowed hard, staring at the screen. Unknown number, meet me. Same place as last time. Last time. My stomach churned. I knew who this was. The person I thought I had covered for. The person I thought had just as much to lose. The person who had been there the night Martin crashed. I turned to Dallas. "Stay here." She shook her head. "No way. I'm coming with you." I hesitated, but I knew there was no arguing. We left, driving in tense silence. My mind replayed that night over and over. The argument, the shouting, the moment everything changed. I pulled into the old motel parking lot, my grip tight on the wheel. The place was nearly abandoned, just a flickering neon sign and a few parked cars. Then I saw them, standing under the street lamp, arms crossed waiting. Madison, Martin's coworker, his friend, and the last person to see him before the crash. I stepped out, my pulse hammering in my ears. Dallas followed, her breath uneven. Madison gave a slow smirk. "Took you long enough, Diana." Dallas turned to me, eyes wide. "You know them?" I couldn't answer. Madison stepped closer, her voice low. "You should have told the truth from the start. What do you want?" I managed, my voice shaking. She exhaled sharply. "I want justice." Dallas stiffened beside me. "Justice for who?" Madison's gaze darkened. "For Martin." My stomach clenched. No. She cut me off. "Let me tell her, since you won't." She turned to Dallas. "Your mother lied to you," Madison said coldly. "She wasn't home that night. She was with me." Dallas froze. "What?" I closed my eyes. "Please don't do this." Madison pressed on. "Martin found out about us, Diana. He knew." Dallas whipped toward me. "Us." I couldn't breathe. Madison's smirk returned. "That's right. Your mother wasn't just lying to the police. She was lying to you." Tears welled in Dallas's eyes. "Mom, tell me she's lying." I couldn't. Because Madison wasn't lying. Martin had found out. That's why he was so angry that night. That's why he was drinking. That's why he was driving so recklessly. And now, the secret I had fought so hard to bury was out. Dallas stumbled back, her face twisted in horror. "Oh my God." Madison leaned in close, her voice a whisper. "You didn't just break his heart, Diana." She tilted her head. "You killed him." I gasped, shaking my head. "No." "Don't lie," Madison snapped. "You told him everything that night. You left him alone, drunk and spiraling, and you let him drive off like that." Tears spilled down Dallas's face. "You knew he was drinking." I reached for her. "Dallas." She pulled away. "You let him die." The words cut deeper than any knife. Madison took a step back, satisfaction gleaming in her eyes. "Now everyone knows, Diana. And soon, so will the police." My breath hitched. "You wouldn't." She smirked. "Try me." Then she walked away, disappearing into the night. I turned to Dallas, but she had already backed away from me. "Dallas, please." She shook her head, her face unreadable. "I don't even know who you are." Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the dark, with nothing left but the truth.